Ethan Blake was not just a man, he was a brand. At 45, he had become the embodiment of modern success. A billionaire tech mogul revered for his sharp business acumen and unapologetic ambition. He was the face of Blake Innovations, a sprawling empire of luxury electronics that seamlessly merged cutting-edge technology with opulence. If a billionaire could have a catchphrase, Ethan's would have been, "Everything has a price, and everything is negotiable." This morning was no different. As the sun crept over the skyline of the bustling city, Ethan's custom Rolls-Royce Phantom glided through the urban jungle. The car itself was a statement of his wealth. Handcrafted leather seats, rare wood paneling, and a built-in entertainment system that would put any luxury suite to shame. Every inch of the vehicle screamed exclusivity, much like its owner. Ethan sat in the back seat, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that was tailored so perfectly it looked as if it had been painted onto him. His silk tie, royal blue with a subtle pattern, added a touch of understated elegance. On his wrist gleamed a watch worth more than most people's annual salaries, a Patek Philippe with an intricate, skeletonized dial. In one hand, Ethan clutched his phone, the latest prototype from his own company, sleek and futuristic, still months away from public release. His other hand toyed with a Montblanc pen, though he seldom needed it anymore. Contracts were signed electronically these days, and Ethan's signature carried enough weight to make even the most skeptical investors align their interests with his. Today was critical. His tech conglomerate was on the verge of acquiring a rival company, one that specialized in artificial intelligence. The deal, worth over $12 billion, would cement Blake Innovations as the undisputed leader in the tech industry. Ethan was scheduled to finalize negotiations at 10 a.m., and the thought of it brought a slight smirk to his otherwise stoic face. For Ethan, winning was not just a habit, it was his addiction. As the car wove through traffic, Ethan's driver, Robert, maintained a respectful silence. Robert had been with Ethan for over a decade and had learned that the best way to keep his job was to blend into the background. Ethan preferred it that way. No small talk, no distractions, just efficiency. Inside the Rolls, the air was thick with the faint scent of leather and Ethan's cologne, a custom blend that cost a fortune but was worth every penny in his eyes. He leaned back into the plush seat, scrolling through emails with the intensity of a chess master planning his next move. One email in particular caught his eye, a message from his CFO summarizing the final terms of the acquisition deal. Ethan read it twice, his sharp eyes scanning for any potential flaws. "Robert," Ethan said without looking up. His voice was crisp, commanding. "Yes, sir?" Robert replied, glancing in the rear-view mirror. "Make sure we're on time. I don't want to keep these people waiting." "We're on schedule, sir," Robert assured him. Ethan nodded and returned to his phone. His schedule for the day was a masterpiece of precision. The acquisition meeting, followed by a lunch with venture capitalists, then a private jet flight to a conference where he was the keynote speaker. His assistant, Claire, had planned every minute of it, and Ethan expected nothing less. Despite his packed schedule, Ethan found time to glance at the financial news app on his phone. The headlines were a chorus of his achievements. Blake Innovations set to dominate AI market. Ethan Blake's empire expands again, and the billionaire who redefined luxury tech. Each article was a testament to his success, and he drank them in like fine wine. But beneath the polished exterior and the accolades lay a man who had sacrificed much for his empire. Ethan's life was a fortress, impenetrable and solitary. He had no close friends, only associates and allies who orbited around him for mutual benefit. His family was a distant memory. He had grown up in a small, struggling household, and his relentless pursuit of success had distanced him from the simple joys of his past. The city outside the Rolls-Royce window was a blur of activity. Vendors peddled their goods on street corners. Teenagers zipped by on skateboards, and office workers hurried to their jobs. Ethan barely noticed any of it. To him, the city was a backdrop, a stage on which he performed his role as a titan of industry. As the car approached a busy intersection, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was Claire, his assistant. "Good morning, Ethan," she said in her usual efficient tone. "Morning. What is it?" Ethan replied, his voice neutral. "Just confirming that everything is set for the acquisition meeting. The conference room has been prepared. and the legal team is already on site. Good? Make sure the media team is ready for the announcement. I want the press release out within an hour of signing the deal. Of course. Anything else? No. I'll see you there. The call ended, and Ethan returned to his thoughts. He didn't just want to close the deal. He wanted to dominate the conversation, to ensure that his name was etched in the annals of corporate history. As the Rolls-Royce approached a red light, the car slowed to a stop. For the first time that morning, Ethan looked up from his phone. The intersection was crowded, chaotic. Street performers played music on one corner while a small group of people handed out flyers on another. A sense of irritation flickered across Ethan's face. He despised inefficiency, and the unpredictability of street life grated on him. Unbeknownst to him, this ordinary red light was about to become a turning point in his meticulously controlled world. The Rolls-Royce Phantom slid to a stop at the intersection, its glossy black exterior gleaming like a polished gem in the midday sun. The busy urban sprawl surrounding the car seemed to pause, as though the vehicle's mere presence commanded attention. Pedestrians craned their necks for a better look, their eyes widening as they recognized the unmistakable aura of wealth. Ethan Blake didn't notice the stares. To him, the red light was nothing more than an inconvenient pause in his meticulously planned schedule. His fingers tapped rhythmically on his phone as he drafted a curt email to a colleague who had dared to question his proposed acquisition terms. The noise outside, the hum of engines, the chatter of street vendors, the occasional honk of a frustrated driver, barely registered in his consciousness. But outside the cocoon of luxury, life at the intersection was anything but quiet. The corner was alive with activity, a chaotic blend of survival and enterprise. Street performers strummed guitars and sang hopeful tunes to passing crowds. A woman juggled oranges for tips, her movements fluid and precise. At a food cart, customers lined up for steaming plates of noodles. The air was thick with a mix of exhaust fumes and the tantalizing aroma of grilled meat. Jamal stood a few feet away from the food cart, clutching a battered red cooler. The 12-year-old's wiry frame was wrapped in a faded hoodie that had once been bright blue, but was now dulled by time and wear. His sneakers, scuffed and mismatched, carried the stories of countless miles walked. Inside the cooler were water bottles, crystal clear, condensation dripping down their sides in the heat. Jamal had been at this corner for hours, weaving between cars with a practiced ease. His voice, though young, carried a certain grit as he called out to drivers, "Water, ice-cold water, just $1." He had learned early that a smile, even a weary one, could go a long way. His hustle wasn't just for pocket money, it was survival. Every dollar Jamal earned went straight to helping his mom pay the rent or buy groceries. Their apartment, a cramped one-bedroom unit in a crumbling building, barely kept the rain out during storms. But it was home, and Jamal was determined to help keep it. As the Rolls-Royce came into view, Jamal's eyes lit up. He wasn't new to spotting opportunities, and a car like that screamed money. He tightened his grip on the cooler and made his way toward the luxurious vehicle, weaving through the maze of honking cars and revving engines with the agility of someone who had done it countless times before. Inside the Rolls, Ethan finally looked up from his phone, his gaze wandering absently through the tinted window. His eyes landed on Jamal, who was now just a few feet from the car. The boy raised a hand in greeting, his lips curling into a hopeful smile. Ethan's brow furrowed. Jamal reached the car and knocked lightly on the window, his knuckles making a muted sound against the thick glass. For a moment, there was no response. Jamal knocked again, a little harder this time. The driver, Robert, glanced at Ethan through the rearview mirror, silently asking if he should shoo the boy away. Ethan sighed and pressed a button, lowering the window just enough to speak. "Hey, mister," Jamal began, his voice upbeat but slightly breathless from navigating the busy street. "You want some water? Only $1. Ice cold." He held up a bottle, its clear liquid glinting in the sunlight. Ethan's gaze flicked from the boy's earnest face to the bottle, and then back again. His expression remained unreadable for a moment before settling into something close to irritation. "No, I don't want water," Ethan said curtly, his voice clipped and authoritative. Why don't you find something better to do with your time? Jamal's smile faltered, the brightness in his eyes dimming. He had heard those words before, many times, but they stung just the same. Still, he nodded, his voice soft as he replied, "Okay. Have a good day, sir." Jamal turned and began to walk away, his shoulders slightly hunched. He didn't let himself linger on the rejection. There were other cars, other potential customers, and he couldn't afford to dwell on one loss. Inside the Rolls, Ethan watched the boy retreat through the window's narrow opening. He felt no immediate pang of guilt. In his world, time was money, and there was no place for interruptions. He pressed the button, and the window slid back up with a soft hum. The light was still red, and Ethan found his attention drawn to Jamal again despite himself. The boy had already approached another car, holding up his water bottle with the same hopeful energy. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he observed the interaction. The driver of the other car, a woman in a modest sedan, rolled down her window and handed Jamal a few bills in exchange for a bottle. Jamal's face lit up in gratitude, his smile returning as he thanked her profusely. Ethan shifted in his seat, an unfamiliar sensation tugging at the edges of his thoughts. He couldn't place it, annoyance, perhaps, or something less defined. He tried to return his focus to his phone, but the sight of the boy lingered in his mind like a smudge on an otherwise pristine glass. The traffic light finally turned green, and Robert eased the car forward. The Rolls-Royce left the intersection behind, gliding smoothly down the road. Ethan glanced at his phone, determined to shake off whatever had momentarily distracted him. His schedule awaited, and he had no time for the trivialities of a street corner. But as the car carried him away from the chaos of the intersection, the image of Jamal, the boy's faded hoodie, his mismatched sneakers, the way his smile had momentarily crumpled under rejection, remained etched in Ethan's mind, an uninvited guest in his otherwise immaculate day. The late morning sun bore down on the busy intersection, casting long shadows of people and cars onto the cracked asphalt. The air was thick with the hum of activity, engines idling, vendors shouting their pitches, and occasional laughter from a group of teenagers sitting on the curb. Amid the chaos, Jamal moved with purpose, his cooler of water bottles swinging at his side. He spotted the Rolls-Royce Phantom, its sleek black surface standing out among the more common sedans and trucks like a king among commoners. For Jamal, the car was a symbol of opportunity, a chance for a decent sale. Wealthy people always had money to spare, or so he believed. Jamal approached the vehicle with a practiced confidence, though his heart beat a little faster. He had learned early that appearing too timid made drivers dismiss him, but being overly assertive could get him yelled at or, worse, ignored altogether. Timing and tone were everything. The car's tinted windows reflected his own face back at him as he approached, his small frame juxtaposed against the imposing machine. Swallowing his nerves, he raised his fist and knocked gently on the window. Inside, Ethan Blake was engrossed in an email about the upcoming acquisition deal, his sharp eyes scanning the details for any potential pitfalls. The knock on the window pulled him out of his concentration like a jolt. His head snapped up, irritation flaring instantly. He hated interruptions, especially when they came from the unpredictable world beyond the tinted glass of his meticulously curated life. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the button to lower the window. Robert, the driver, glanced at him in the rear-view mirror, silently waiting for instructions. Ethan sighed audibly, more out of annoyance than curiosity, and pressed the button. The window slid down just a few inches, enough to reveal the face of a young boy standing on the other side. "Hey, mister," Jamal began, his voice carrying a mixture of hope and determination. He held up a bottle of water, its clear plastic glinting in the sunlight. "You want some water? Only $1. Ice cold." For a moment, Ethan said nothing. His gaze swept over the boy, taking in the worn hoodie that hung loosely on his thin frame, the sneakers with holes in the toes, and the cooler that had clearly seen better days. To Ethan, the scene was a disruption, an unwelcome reminder of a world he had worked so hard to leave behind. "No, I don't want water," Ethan said finally, his tone clipped and cold. His words were deliberate, each one carrying the weight of dismissal. He could have stopped there, but something about the boy's earnestness rubbed him the wrong way. "Why don't you stop wasting time and do something useful with your life?" Jamal froze, the corners of his smile faltering for the briefest moment. The words stung, sharper than he expected. But Jamal was no stranger to rejection. He had heard worse in his young life, and he had learned to push through. With a quiet resilience that belied his years, he nodded and stepped back, his voice soft but steady as he replied, "Have a good day, sir." Ethan watched as Jamal turned and walked away, his small shoulders squared against the weight of the rejection. The boy moved with the quiet dignity of someone who couldn't afford to let their emotions show, even when they wanted to. Ethan's gaze lingered on him for a second longer before he rolled the window back up. "That's enough of that," Ethan muttered to himself, shaking his head as he returned his focus to his phone. His world was one of high-stakes decisions and calculated risks. He had no time for the sentimental distractions of street corners and water bottles. But as the car idled at the red light, Ethan found himself glancing up from his phone again. Through the tinted glass, he watched Jamal approach another car, a battered sedan with a woman in the driver's seat. The boy knocked on the window and offered his water with the same hopeful pitch. This time, the driver rolled her window down and handed him a couple of dollars. Jamal's face lit up as he handed her a bottle, his smile wide and genuine as he thanked her. Ethan frowned, a flicker of something unfamiliar tugging at the edges of his thoughts. He told himself it was irritation. After all, why should a child be out here hawking water instead of being in school? Didn't his parents care? Or was this just another example of people not taking responsibility for their lives? Ethan had little patience for excuses, even less for inefficiency. Still, the boy's face lingered in his mind, an unshakable image that clung to his thoughts like a burr. It wasn't just the boy's persistence that struck him. It was the faint but undeniable glimmer of determination in his eyes. Ethan recognized that look. It was the same fire he had once carried, back when he was a struggling college student working 3 jobs to make ends meet. The memory was fleeting but vivid. The long nights delivering pizzas, the countless rejections from potential investors, and the gnawing hunger that had driven him to succeed at all costs. Ethan had built his empire on the foundation of that hunger, but he had buried the memory of those years beneath layers of luxury and success. Now, here it was unearthing itself at the most inconvenient time. The light turned green, and the Rolls-Royce began to move forward. Ethan forced his attention back to his phone, scrolling through his emails with a practiced indifference. But the boy's face wouldn't leave him. It was as though the brief encounter had left a mark, a hairline crack in the polished armor of his carefully constructed life. Robert glanced at him again in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed slightly. He had worked for Ethan long enough to recognize when something was bothering him, but he knew better than to ask. Instead, he focused on navigating the busy streets, leaving Ethan to his thoughts. As the car merged into traffic, the bustling intersection faded into the distance. Jamal was already back to his routine, moving from car to car with the persistence of someone who couldn't afford to stop. For him, the interaction with Ethan was just another moment in a long day of hard work. For Ethan, it was something else entirely, a spark, a question he couldn't yet articulate, but could feel simmering just beneath the surface. The Rolls-Royce moved smoothly through the intersection as the light turned green, its powerful engine purring beneath the polished surface. Robert, the driver, eased the car forward, merging seamlessly into the flow of traffic. From the back seat, Ethan watched the city pass by, but his mind remained elsewhere, lingering on the brief encounter with Jamal. At first, Ethan tried to push the thought aside. It was a fleeting moment, nothing more than a minor inconvenience. A street vendor trying to make a living. Why should he care? His world was far removed from that boy's struggles. He had worked hard to escape that life, to build something that was entirely his own. The past, with its humble beginnings, was just that, the past. Yet, despite his best efforts to refocus, Jamal's disappointed face continued to appear in his thoughts, like an image burned into his mind. The boy's wide, expectant eyes, his hopeful pitch, all of it played out over and over in Ethan's mind. The words he had spoken to Jamal echoed, louder and louder. Why don't you stop wasting time and do something useful with your life? Ethan's fingers tightened around his phone, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't a sentimental man. He didn't have the time or the inclination for charity. People like Jamal were part of the fabric of society, unseen, forgotten, and struggling to make ends meet. Ethan had seen enough of them to know that their plight was mostly self-inflicted. They made bad choices. They failed to rise above their circumstances. He had risen, hadn't he? But no matter how much he tried to justify his words, the sense of guilt only grew. It wasn't like him to feel guilty, especially over something so trivial. He had spent years building his empire, and guilt had no place in his world. He was too busy, too focused on the bigger picture. But as the car rolled through the city streets, his thoughts began to pull him back to another time, one that he had buried deep beneath layers of success and luxury. He remembered his childhood home, a small, worn-out house in a forgotten part of town. The walls had been thin, the floors creaky, and the air often smelled of dampness. His mother had worked long hours as a waitress, scraping together just enough to keep food on the table. His father had been absent, a shadowy figure in his life who had never provided the guidance or support Ethan needed. It was just him and his mother, struggling to make ends meet. Ethan had spent years watching his mother work tirelessly, trying to make their lives better. He had learned early that the world didn't owe anyone anything. You had to fight for what you wanted, take it with both hands, and never look back. Hard work had been the mantra he had lived by, and it had taken him from those meager beginnings to the heights of corporate power. But looking back, it wasn't the work ethic that had driven him. It had been the hunger to escape, to prove that he was more than the circumstances of his birth. The hunger to create a life where he didn't have to worry about bills, where his name wasn't just another face in the crowd. He had walked to school in shoes that were too small, patched them up with duct tape when they wore through. He had spent weekends mowing lawns and washing cars, all for a few dollars. The days were long, and the nights were filled with the sounds of his mother crying softly after a hard day. He had hated those sounds, hated the helplessness he felt, and he swore he would never be in that position again. Yet here he was, sitting in the back of a multi-million-dollar car, with every luxury at his disposal, feeling a strange twist of guilt for something as insignificant as a brief interaction with a child on the street. It made no sense. He had earned his success, had fought for it, had sacrificed everything to reach the top. Why should he care about a kid who was just trying to sell a bottle of water to make a few dollars? Still, the memory of his own struggles gnawed at him, and he couldn't seem to shake it. The boy's face, full of hope and quiet determination, haunted him. He had been in Jamal's shoes once, though in a different context. He had been that kid scraping together every penny he could. He knew what it was like to face the world with nothing but raw ambition and a dream. The city outside the Rolls' tinted windows continued to pass by, the buildings and people blurring into the background. Ethan's thoughts grew darker, clouded by a sense of disquiet he couldn't name. What if Jamal's life was different because of one simple interaction? What if his words, those careless, cold words, had left a mark that couldn't be erased? The car turned onto another street, the familiar hum of the engine a dull background to Ethan's spiraling thoughts. He remembered how, when he had been Jamal's age, all he wanted was for someone, anyone, to recognize his potential, to see that he wasn't just a kid from the wrong side of the tracks. He had wished for just one person to acknowledge that he was working hard, that he had dreams bigger than his circumstances. Yet all he had ever received was rejection. And now he had become the very thing he had despised. Someone who looked down on people like Jamal, someone who had built walls around his life, walls that kept the rest of the world at arm's length. How had he become this person? His fingers tightened around his phone once more, but this time, the screen blurred. He couldn't focus on the emails or the deals that lay ahead. His mind kept returning to the boy, to Jamal, and to his own journey, a journey he had built on anger and pride. But at what cost? "Robert," Ethan said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, sir," the driver replied, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "Take me back to that intersection," Ethan muttered. His heart was pounding now, an unfamiliar feeling of unease filling his chest. The decision surprised him. He hadn't planned on going back. He had a full day ahead, meetings, deals to close, a flight to catch. He had places to be, people to impress. Yet something inside him told him that he couldn't simply ignore what had happened. He had to make it right, even if he didn't yet understand how. The car slowed as it made a U-turn, the engine humming in the quiet that settled between them. As they neared the intersection, Ethan's gaze fell on the street, the vendors, the cars, and, though he couldn't yet see him, the boy. His stomach tightened with anticipation. This wasn't just about buying a bottle of water. It was about confronting something he had long avoided. The realization that his wealth and success, the very things he had worked so tirelessly to attain, might not be enough to make him feel at peace. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the bustling streets as Ethan sat silently in the back seat of his Rolls-Royce. The weight of his conscience pressed down on him like an anchor. He had spent hours trying to shake the image of Jamal's face, the look of quiet rejection and the sound of his soft voice. At first, Ethan had convinced himself it was nothing, just a boy selling water on a street corner. Nothing more. But the longer he tried to move past it, the more the guilt gnawed at him. It wasn't just the words he had spoken, but the realization that he had become the kind of person who could say them without a second thought. Ethan had built his entire life on the idea that success meant power, and power meant control. But the further he distanced himself from his roots, the more he began to see how empty it all was. His empire, his luxury, his wealth, it all felt hollow when he considered the price he had paid to acquire it. In pursuit of his ambition, he had buried the part of himself that once understood struggle, that once recognized the humanity in every person, no matter their circumstances. Robert, Ethan's voice was low but firm. The driver, who had been quiet for the past hour, glanced up at the rearview mirror. "Yes, sir. I need you to take me back to that intersection, where I saw the boys selling water earlier." Ethan's words hung in the air between them, a stark contrast to the calculated business discussions that usually filled his days. Robert hesitated, his eyes flicking between the road and the rearview mirror. "Are you sure, sir? You have a full evening ahead of you." His voice was tinged with uncertainty. Ethan sighed, his fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. "Yes, Robert. Just take me there." Without a word, Robert nodded and changed course, maneuvering the car through the city streets with practiced ease. The Rolls-Royce's smooth hum filled the silence, but for Ethan, the minutes stretched on like hours. His thoughts were turbulent, swirling with regret, doubt, and an inexplicable desire to make things right. As the car neared the intersection, the sounds of the city grew louder. The rush of traffic, the distant chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional honking horn all merged into a dull roar. Ethan's stomach twisted with anxiety. What was he expecting? An apology? A grand gesture? He didn't even know. All he knew was that he needed to see the boy again, to make amends in some way that made sense, though he wasn't sure how that could be done. The intersection came into view, and Ethan's eyes immediately scanned the area. The street vendors were still there, moving through the sea of cars, selling everything from snacks to trinkets. But Jamal was nowhere to be found. The light was red when the Rolls-Royce stopped, but Ethan's attention wasn't on the traffic. His gaze was fixed on the corner, where a few people were packing up their stalls for the evening. A pang of disappointment shot through him as he saw the boy, Jamal, hunched over, gathering his cooler and stacking the empty water bottles. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, as though the weight of the day had already taken its toll. "Stop the car," Ethan commanded, his voice tight with urgency. Robert obeyed without question, bringing the vehicle to a halt at the curb. Ethan pushed open the door, stepping out onto the sidewalk. The fresh evening air hit him, a stark contrast to the stuffiness of the car. He moved toward the corner with quick, purposeful steps, the sounds of the city blurring into the background. Jamal was still focused on packing up his cooler, his back turned to Ethan as he carefully placed the last of the bottles inside. His worn sneakers scuffed against the pavement as he bent down to grab a stray bottle. Ethan approached cautiously, unsure of how to begin. He wasn't used to feeling this way, unsure, vulnerable, or even out of his element. But something had shifted inside him, and he knew he couldn't walk away again. "Hey," Ethan called out, his voice softer than he intended. Jamal froze for a moment, his hand hovering over the cooler. Slowly, he turned around, his tired eyes meeting Ethan's. For a split second, the two of them stood in silence, an awkwardness hanging in the air. Jamal's expression was guarded, as though he didn't quite believe what he was seeing. Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his voice faltering slightly. The question felt foreign to him, as if he had never asked anyone that before. Jamal blinked, his brow furrowing as he looked up at Ethan. "Yeah, I'm fine." His voice was wary guarded. He probably expected another snide comment, another rejection. Ethan took a deep breath. This wasn't about pity. It wasn't about a quick fix or some grand gesture. It was about acknowledging that he had wronged someone. A child, no less. And that realization was harder to admit than he had ever imagined. I wanted to apologize," Ethan said, his words coming out with a sincerity he hadn't known he was capable of. Earlier, he stopped himself, unsure of how to put it into words. "What I said to you was wrong. I shouldn't have treated you that way." Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly, as though he was trying to understand what Ethan was saying. "You don't have to apologize," he muttered, his tone low but not unfriendly. "It's all right. I'm used to it." Ethan felt a pang in his chest at Jamal's response. Used to it? That was the part that hurt the most. The idea that Jamal, just a kid, had learned to expect cruelty, rejection, and indifference from people like him. "No, it's not all right," Ethan said, his voice firm now. He took a step closer, his gaze steady. "You didn't deserve that." "No one does." Jamal remained quiet for a long moment, as if processing Ethan's words. The streetlights flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the corner, but the tension between them still hung in the air. Finally, Jamal spoke again, his voice a little softer. "Thanks, I guess." He didn't sound convinced, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a slight softening in his expression. Ethan glanced down at the cooler, then back at the boy. A thought occurred to him, one that felt right for the first time in hours. "Hey," Ethan said, pulling a few bills from his wallet. "I'll buy some water. I wasn't planning on it earlier, but I think it's the least I can do now." He handed Jamal the money, not as a transaction, but as an offering of goodwill. Jamal looked at the money for a moment before taking it, his hands slightly shaking. "Thanks. I appreciate it." Ethan smiled faintly, the weight in his chest beginning to lift. There was still a lot of work to be done, a lot of old habits to break, but this moment, this small gesture, felt like a step in the right direction. As he turned to leave, he called over his shoulder, "Good luck, Jamal. I hope tomorrow's a better day." For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a sense of peace. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could start to change the way he saw the world. And perhaps, just perhaps, this small act of kindness would be the beginning of a much larger change. Act 6, The Second Encounter. The Rolls-Royce glided to a stop on the familiar street corner, its sleek body reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. Ethan stepped out of the car, the sound of the door closing with a soft thud echoing in the quiet evening air. It was rare for someone like him to leave the cocoon of his luxurious vehicle, especially when the world outside felt so foreign. But today was different. His tailored suit felt almost out of place against the backdrop of the busy intersection, where vendors and pedestrians moved like clockwork, all caught in their daily routines. Ethan was conscious of the stares, the brief glances from strangers who surely recognized the Rolls-Royce and the man stepping out of it. They probably assumed he was just another wealthy figure, an untouchable entity floating above the chaos of the streets. But today, he wasn't just a CEO. He wasn't a businessman or a man with deals and dollars on his mind. Today, he was just a man who had realized something about himself. A man who had, for the first time in years, felt the need to connect, to make amends for the harshness he had once allowed to define him. As he approached the corner where Jamal had been earlier, his footsteps were deliberate, but there was an uncertainty in his stride. He wasn't sure how Jamal would react. The boy had every right to ignore him, to turn away after the cruel words he'd spoken earlier. But Ethan was determined. He needed to do this. He needed to make things right. Jamal, busy adjusting the contents of his cooler, looked up as he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. His gaze met Ethan's, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in the boy's eyes. He seemed to hesitate, his expression guarded as he registered the suited man approaching him once again. Ethan stopped a few paces away, giving Jamal the space to decide how to react. The boy's eyes narrowed, but he didn't make a move to walk away. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice quieter this time, softer. "Hey," he said, trying to make himself sound less like the businessman he was and more like someone simply trying to do the right thing. I was wrong earlier. Can I buy some water?" Jamal looked at him for a moment, and Ethan could see the skepticism flicker in the boy's eyes. He didn't trust him, and who could blame him? Ethan had been just another adult who dismissed him without a second thought. But this time, something in Jamal's demeanor shifted. The boy didn't speak right away, but he took a slow step forward, pulling a bottle of water from the cooler. "It's still $1, Jamal said, his voice a little more subdued than before. The wariness was still there, but it was tempered by a hint of curiosity. Ethan smiled, a genuine, small smile that felt unfamiliar on his lips. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp $100 bill, and handed it to Jamal without a second thought. "Keep the change," he said, his voice steady. "And tell me, why are you out here selling water?" Jamal paused, his fingers hesitating around the bill before he slowly took it, his eyes wide with surprise. For a moment, he just stared at the money, as if unsure how to respond. But when he spoke, his voice was soft, almost tentative. "I'm saving up for my mom," Jamal said, his gaze lowering to the ground as though the weight of the words were heavy. "She's been having a hard time paying the rent lately, and I'm trying to help her out. And I need to buy some school supplies for the year, too." Ethan stood quietly for a moment, taking in the boy's words. He hadn't expected that answer. He hadn't expected this level of responsibility from a child who couldn't have been older than 12. Jamal wasn't just out there trying to sell water for himself. He was doing it to help his family, to make sure his mother could keep their home, and that he had the things he needed for school. Ethan's heart tightened as he thought about his own upbringing. He had grown up with a single mother who worked tirelessly to provide for him, just like Jamal's mother. But unlike Jamal, Ethan hadn't been out on the streets selling anything. He had been able to rely on his mother's love and determination to get by, while Jamal had taken matters into his own hands. He had the strength to face the world on his own terms, to stand in the heat and sell bottles of water to strangers, all for the sake of his family. "Your mom is lucky to have you," Ethan said, his voice sincere, as he watched Jamal carefully. The boy looked up at him with a mixture of surprise and disbelief, as if he hadn't expected anyone to say something kind. "I don't know about that," Jamal muttered, glancing away. "She works hard too. It's just things are tough, you know?" Ethan nodded. He knew all too well. Things were always tough when you were fighting to survive, fighting to make sure your family had everything it needed. It was something he had lived through himself. But Jamal, this boy, he was doing something about it. He wasn't waiting for someone else to fix things for him. He was stepping up, and in that moment, Ethan realized just how much he had taken for granted in his own life. "I get it," Ethan said quietly. "I know what it's like to have to fight for the things you need." He paused, looking at the boy more closely now. "You're doing the right thing. And if there's anything I can do to help..." Jamal shook his head quickly, his face flushing slightly. "I'm fine. I just need to keep working." He took a deep breath and then offered Ethan a tentative smile, one that was small but real. "But thanks for, the water and everything." Ethan smiled back, feeling the weight in his chest lift just a little. "You're welcome. And remember, if you ever need help, don't hesitate to ask." Jamal nodded, but there was a guardedness in his eyes, a reluctance to accept anything that might feel like charity. Ethan understood that. It was a pride he respected, pride in one's ability to handle things on their own. But there was also a flicker of something else in Jamal's eyes now. It wasn't just skepticism. It was the first hint of trust. "I'll keep that in mind," Jamal said softly. As Ethan turned to walk back toward his car, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He had come to the intersection that day to make amends, to right a wrong. But what he hadn't expected was to gain a deeper understanding of what it meant to struggle, to survive, to work for the things that truly mattered. As he climbed back into the Rolls-Royce, he glanced back at Jamal, who had already moved on to the next car in line. The boy was still selling his water, still fighting for his family, still doing everything he could to make things work. And Ethan knew that this was just the beginning of his own journey to change. The following morning, Ethan woke earlier than usual. The daylight seemed sharper, the air cleaner, as though the city had been washed anew. He hadn't been able to shake the memory of his conversation with Jamal the night before. The boy's words echoed in his mind as he stood by his office window, watching the city come to life. Ethan Blake had never been someone who made decisions on impulse. Every move he made in the business world had been calculated, precise, grounded in years of planning and preparation. Yet, something about the brief exchange with Jamal had stirred something in him. Something he couldn't quite explain, but knew was undeniably real. The idea of helping, of stepping outside of his carefully crafted world to make a tangible difference, felt like a call to action that he could not ignore. He sat at his desk, staring at his laptop, but unable to focus on the documents in front of him. His mind kept drifting back to Jamal, the way the boy had spoken about his family, his mother, and the struggles he faced just to keep things together. It was a kind of resilience that Ethan hadn't encountered in years, and it was this resilience that made him rethink everything he thought he knew about success, about giving, and about the power he held. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years, his assistant Charlotte. When she answered, her voice as steady and professional as ever, Ethan didn't hesitate. "Charlotte, I need you to arrange a meeting. I want Jamal and his mother to come to my office today. You can find their contact information through the Street Vendor Network, right?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Mr. Blake. I'll get in touch with them right away. What's the purpose of the meeting, if you don't mind me asking?" Ethan paused, running a hand through his hair, unsure of how to articulate what he felt. "Just arrange it, Charlotte. I'll explain everything when they arrive." As soon as the call ended, Ethan felt a wave of anxiety sweep over him. What exactly was he going to say to Jamal and his mother? He didn't have a clear plan, just an overwhelming desire to do something more. Ethan had always been a man who was used to controlling situations, but now he felt like he was stepping into the unknown. Hours passed, and before he knew it, Charlotte called to confirm that Jamal and his mother would arrive at noon. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he looked over his schedule for the day. He had meetings stacked back to back, negotiations with potential investors, company updates, and the usual pile of emails that needed his attention. But none of it seemed to matter now. At noon, Ethan paced the length of his office, glancing at his watch every few minutes. When the door finally opened, Charlotte appeared first, guiding Jamal and his mother into the room. Ethan had seen many people over the years, business partners, politicians, celebrities. But there was something different about meeting Jamal's mother, a woman whose worn face told a story of long hours and endless sacrifice. She was petite, her clothes simple but neat, and her eyes held a mixture of weariness and wariness as she stepped into the polished office. Jamal stood at her side, his usual guardedness softened by the fact that they had made it this far. "Miss Carter, Jamal." Ethan greeted them with a smile that felt more genuine than any of the smiles he'd offered in countless boardrooms. "Thank you for coming." Jamal's mother, Mrs. Carter, nodded but said nothing, as if unsure of what to expect from a man like Ethan Blake. Jamal, however, looked around the room with curiosity, his eyes wide as he took in the sleek, modern furniture and the large windows overlooking the city. Ethan gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Please have a seat." He waited until they were both seated before continuing, his voice steady but filled with a rare warmth. "I wanted to invite you here today because I've been thinking a lot about what you said, Jamal." Jamal's eyes flickered up at him, his expression guarded. "What do you mean, Mr. Blake?" Ethan leaned forward slightly, meeting Jamal's gaze with sincerity. "I've been thinking about how hard you're working, how much you're sacrificing for your family, and I wanted to offer you an opportunity." Mrs. Carter frowned, her voice tinged with suspicion. "What kind of opportunity? We didn't come here for charity." Ethan held up his hand to stop her, a calm but firm gesture. "This isn't charity, Mrs. Carter. This is an opportunity for Jamal to get the education he deserves, for him to be able to pursue a future that isn't limited by his circumstances." Jamal shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "What do you mean?" "I'm just trying to help my mom. I don't need no handouts." Ethan nodded, understanding the boy's reluctance. I know you don't want a handout, Jamal. That's not what I'm offering. What I'm offering is something far more valuable. The chance to build your future, to get an education without having to worry about the financial burden. I want to cover your tuition for the next few years. I'll also help you with your family's rent, as long as you promise me one thing. That you'll take this seriously, that you'll work as hard as you can, just like you've been doing already. The words hung in the air for a moment, and there was a long silence as Jamal and his mother processed what Ethan had just said. Jamal's face was a mixture of confusion and disbelief, while Mrs. Carter's expression softened, her eyes filling with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Why would you do that? Mrs. Carter finally asked, her voice quieter now. Ethan sat back in his chair, his gaze steady but kind. Because I believe in giving people the chance to better themselves. I know what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to fight for something better. Jamal has the potential to do something big with his life, but he needs the opportunity. Jamal looked at his mother, uncertainty in his eyes. I don't know if I can do all that. I mean, what if I mess up? Ethan smiled. You'll make mistakes, Jamal. We all do. But it's about learning, growing, and never giving up. You've already shown me that you have the drive. Now, I want to help you take it further. For the first time, Jamal looked at Ethan with something close to awe in his eyes. You really mean it? Ethan nodded. I do. This is your chance, Jamal. A chance to do something big with your life. Don't let fear stop you. If you work hard, there's no limit to what you can achieve. Mrs. Carter looked at her son, then back at Ethan. Her voice was low, but filled with emotion. Thank you. We don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Ethan replied, his voice warm. Just take the opportunity and make the most of it. I'm here to support you both. As the meeting came to an end, Jamal and his mother stood up, still processing everything that had just happened. Ethan walked them to the door, and before they left, Jamal turned back to him. I won't let you down, Mr. Blake, he said, his voice filled with determination. Ethan smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I know you won't, Jamal. As the door closed behind them, Ethan stood for a moment, letting the gravity of what he had just done settle in. He had offered more than financial assistance. He had offered Jamal the chance to change the trajectory of his life. And in doing so, he had found something he didn't know he had been missing: purpose. Months passed, and with each day, Jamal's life transformed. What had begun as a fleeting moment at a red light had blossomed into a life-changing journey for both him and Ethan. Ethan had become more than just a benefactor. He had become a mentor, a guide, and unexpectedly, a friend. In return, Jamal had become more than just a young boy struggling to help his family. He had become a student, eager to learn, filled with ambition, and brimming with potential. Ethan watched with pride as Jamal flourished. The shy, reserved boy who once stood on street corners, selling water bottles to survive, had grown into someone with a clear vision of the future. He had enrolled in a local school where he excelled, his natural intelligence and work ethic quickly making him stand out. But it wasn't just academic success that filled Ethan with pride. It was Jamal's resilience, his unwavering commitment to his family, and his drive to make a better life for himself that truly touched Ethan's heart. The mentorship had started slowly, with Ethan offering advice and guidance during their weekly meetings. They would meet at Ethan's office, sometimes for business discussions, other times simply to talk about life. Ethan would share his own experiences, talking about the challenges he had faced growing up, about how hard he had worked to build his own success. Jamal, in turn, would talk about his own struggles, the pressure to help his mother, the doubts he sometimes had about whether he was truly good enough to succeed, the fears that came with trying to escape the life he had always known. But the conversations always ended with the same message. You're not alone in this, Jamal. I believe in you. And that belief, that quiet but steady encouragement, kept Jamal going even when the road was tough. It wasn't just academic success that Ethan had helped Jamal with. He had also introduced him to new opportunities. Jamal had interned at Ethan's company, working in various departments to learn the ropes of business and technology. He had spent time with the engineers, learning about coding and design. He had worked with the marketing team, developing communication skills and understanding how to market products. It wasn't just about learning a trade. It was about instilling a sense of confidence in Jamal, making him believe that he was capable of achieving great things. Every time they met, Ethan could see the transformation in Jamal. He was no longer the boy who struggled to find his place in the world. He was becoming a young man with a vision, a drive to not only better his own life, but to help others along the way. Ethan had always prided himself on being a successful businessman, but it was Jamal's growth that had truly given him a sense of purpose. He had helped the boy find his path, and in the process, Ethan had rediscovered his own. Their bond, once defined by a simple act of charity, had become something deeper. It was a relationship built on mutual respect, understanding, and a shared vision for the future. Ethan had learned as much from Jamal as Jamal had learned from him. The boy's determination, humility, and relentless pursuit of a better life had reminded Ethan of what truly mattered: the importance of using one's resources to make a positive impact on the world. And as Jamal grew, so too did his relationship with his mother, Mrs. Carter. With Ethan's help, Jamal had been able to pay for his family's rent, easing the financial strain that had weighed heavily on his mother's shoulders for so long. The relief in her eyes every time they met spoke volumes about how much Ethan's support had meant to her. She had always believed in her son, but now she saw that he had a real chance at a future that didn't involve the daily struggle for survival. One crisp morning, months after their first meeting at the intersection, Ethan found himself driving through the same streets that had once been the backdrop of their brief but life-altering encounter. As the car slowed to a stop at the familiar red light, Ethan's thoughts drifted to Jamal, who had recently completed his first semester of college and was preparing to attend a summer program at one of the best universities in the country. Ethan looked out the window and saw Jamal standing at the very same intersection where they had met all those months ago. But this time, Jamal wasn't selling water. He was holding a stack of brochures, talking to people who passed by, sharing his story of how he had changed his life. He was no longer just trying to survive. He was now actively helping others by raising awareness about education opportunities for underprivileged children. It was clear that Jamal had found his calling, a way to give back to the community that had supported him. Ethan couldn't help but smile as he watched Jamal interact with people. His posture was confident, his voice strong, and his eyes filled with the same determination that had made him so remarkable from the start. Ethan knew that Jamal was on the path to something even greater than he had imagined. The light turned green, but instead of driving past, Ethan instructed his driver to pull over. He got out of the car and approached Jamal, who looked up in surprise. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Ethan could see the recognition in Jamal's face. "Mr. Blake," Jamal said, grinning. "What are you doing here?" Ethan smiled back, feeling a deep sense of pride. "I'm just here to see how you're doing, Jamal. I'm proud of everything you've accomplished." Jamal's expression softened, and he nodded. "I'm doing all right. Got a lot going on, but I'm happy. This is what I've always wanted, to help people like me." Ethan stood beside him for a moment, watching as Jamal interacted with a few more people, offering advice and sharing information. It was a stark contrast to the young boy who had first approached his car, the boy whose biggest worry had been selling a bottle of water just to make ends meet. Now, Jamal was sharing knowledge, offering hope, and showing others that they, too, could change their lives. "I never thought I'd be here," Jamal said, breaking the silence. I never thought I'd get this far. I was just trying to survive, But now I feel like I'm actually making a difference." Ethan looked at him thoughtfully. Sometimes, life gives us red lights to make us stop and see what really matters. You stopped, Jamal, and because you did, you're making an impact on others. I couldn't be more proud of you. Jamal's face lit up at the praise. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mr. Blake. You were the one who gave me a chance when no one else would. You showed me that there's more to life than just getting by." Ethan placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "And you've taken that chance and run with it. You've done the hard work. I just opened a door for you, but you're the one who's walking through it, making your own path." The two stood there for a moment, both reflecting on how far they had come. Ethan realized that this moment, this simple conversation at the same intersection where their journey had started, was the culmination of everything they had worked for. Jamal had not only changed his own life, but he had become a catalyst for change in others' lives as well. "You've grown, Jamal, not just in knowledge, but in heart," Ethan said, his voice full of admiration. Jamal nodded. "I've learned a lot. You taught me that it's not just about what you can take from the world, but what you can give back. I've got big plans, Mr. Blake. I want to help other kids like me. I want to show them that there's more to life than the streets." Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride and satisfaction. The boy who once stood at the corner with a cooler of water had become a young man with a vision, a dream that was now taking shape in ways Ethan could never have imagined. As they spoke, the hustle and bustle of the city swirled around them. But in that moment, everything felt still. Ethan knew that this was the kind of success that mattered. The kind that didn't come from numbers on a balance sheet or accolades in the business world, but from the difference one person could make in another's life. "I'm glad I stopped that day," Ethan said quietly. "I think I needed to see you, Jamal, to remind me of what truly matters." Jamal looked up at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I'm glad you stopped too, Mr. Blake. You showed me what's possible." Ethan chuckled softly. Sometimes it's not about the big moments. Sometimes it's the little ones that change everything. That red light, the decision to help, that's where it all began. And now look at you. Jamal smiled, his confidence shining through. "Yeah, and I'm just getting started." As they stood together at that intersection, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had given Jamal a chance, but Jamal had given him something in return, a reminder of what it truly meant to make a difference. It wasn't about wealth, power, or success in the traditional sense. It was about human connection, about lifting each other up and making the world a better place. "Let's keep moving forward," Ethan said, looking at Jamal with a sense of excitement for what the future held. "The world is full of opportunities. We just have to be ready to take them." Jamal nodded, his eyes gleaming with determination. "I'm ready, Mr. Blake. Let's do this." As the two of them walked away from the intersection, the world seemed a little brighter, a little more hopeful. And as they left the past behind, they both knew that their shared journey had only just begun. Together, they would continue to make a difference, one step at a time.